All right, hello everybody. Hi, thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Tonight at Left Bank Books, we are delighted to welcome National Book Award finalist Sarah Smarsh and her new book, Bone of the Bone, Essays on America by a Daughter of the Working Class. So some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is only possible because of your support. When you shop at Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into our local economy, so it helps keep our streets paved and our parks amazing and everything else that makes St. Louis great. So thank you all so much for shopping local and supporting us tonight and allowing us to get authors the support that they deserve. We also want to extend a welcome to our virtual audience tonight. Thank you very much for joining us from wherever you are. We appreciate you being here. And you'll be able to participate in the Q&A at the end by leaving your question as a YouTube comment. So thank you so much. We at Left Bank are always working hard to plan new events for readers of all ages. Of note, next week on September 25th, we've got WashU professor Patty Hayda here to discuss her new book, Radical Atlas of Ferguson, USA, a highly anticipated book charting the systemic forces that have defined Ferguson and the surrounding area. And on the 26th, we'll be joined by Allison Fergal with her new book, Likeable Badass, How Women Get the Success They Deserve. So both of those events and many more can be found on our website, left-bank.com. So like I said, there's sure to be something for everybody. And now for tonight's event. Sarah Smarsh is a journalist who has reported for the New York Times, Harper's Magazine, The Guardian, and many other publications. Her first book, Heartland, a memoir of working hard and being broke in the richest country on earth, was a finalist for the National Book Award. Her second book, She Comes By It Natural, Dolly Parton and the Women Who Lived Her Songs, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. Smarsh is a frequent political commentator and a speaker on socioeconomic class. Her new book is a collection of brilliant and provocative essays that has established her as one of the most important commentators of socioeconomic class in America. In Bone of the Bone, Sarah brings her graceful storytelling and incisive critique to the challenges that define our times: class division, political fissures, gender inequality, environmental crises, media bias, the rural-urban gulf, and so many other important issues. Kirkus Reviews says this collection's impact is staggering, and with a distinct style, Smarsh's voice is constant, studied, and compassionate. This powerful reckoning with the cost of being poor should be required short-form nonfiction reading. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming the wonderful Sarah Smarsh.
Hi there. Thanks so much for coming out on such a beautiful evening. Thank you, Evan. Thanks to Left Bank Books. And thanks not just for being here to support my book tour and my work, but also in doing so, of course, supporting independent booksellers, local indie bookstores who, to my mind, in recent times have emerged as not just centers of local commerce and important pillars of local economies, but also community centers and we might argue even pillars of democracy in their offering a safe space often and a place where ideas can be safely shared. And so I'm so happy to be here and happy to be in the middle of the country. My favorite part of it. If you know my work, you might know that I hail from Kansas, and I spent most of last week. The book came out a week ago today. Yeah, I had the misfortune, you might say, of a book coming out the same day as, I don't know if you heard, but there was a presidential debate in terms of news cycles. But it's been lovely all the while. Anyhow, but last week I was mostly on the East Coast. And I write not just about socioeconomic class and how that intersects with gender and other aspects of identity, but also to a great extent about place. And that aspect of my work might be of particular interest to you, being here and sharing with me a region that some folks refer to casually as flyover country, as though you wouldn't walk there, you wouldn't go there, you would only fly over it. And you know better than that there's good people everywhere and beauty and diversity and lovely life to be found right here in the middle of the country. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how this book came to be, because in doing so, I think I'll also tell you quite a bit about the book itself. So I It's a collection of essays, of course, as is indicated by the subtitle. That isn't what I set out to do as a writer necessarily. In fact, one of my former journalism professors at the University of Kansas, he was there, Larry Baden, I see in the audience, hello. And so I'm a trained reporter. I graduated from the journalism school at KU over 20 years ago, and I spent about 10 years working in that capacity as a journalist. And so there are a couple things I found that sort of lead me to an explanation of how and why this book came to be. One, in any given newsroom where I worked, I found that, to my knowledge at least, these things aren't always visible and aren't always discussed, but it seemed pretty apparent on multiple levels that I would be the only person among my colleagues who had direct experience of poverty, and also the only person among my colleagues who had direct experience of living in a rural place, or let's say like a deeply rural place. I grew up on a 5th generation wheat farm west of Wichita. I was a 1st generation college student raised by my grandparents in an economic strata where I did experience food insecurity and housing insecurity a couple times growing up, but for the most part, there was food to eat and a roof over our heads, so I never would have referred to myself as poor, but that was just because everybody I knew was poor. Then I got to a college campus and found out, oh, we were poor. And that was even at, a state university where I was mostly, mixed in with, say, middle-class kids. And, I spent my summers working in wheat fields, driving a grain truck to the grain elevator. And my friends spent their summers going to summer camp. And I had 2 or 3 jobs and they didn't have any. And I'm speaking in generalities. There are, of course, other kids from similar circumstances on that campus, no doubt, but not enough of them that I ran into many. And so I found that I had, I guess, what I would call a burgeoning class consciousness arising at that moment. And then I ended up in graduate school at Columbia University, an Ivy League institution. And then I really found out we were poor. Then I found out we were poor. And there, that same consciousness continued to arise. And then for about a decade, I'm working in newsrooms and in a reportorial capacity as someone who, was the only one on staff who had those sorts of experiences. And I would say also for that reason, it wasn't just like a personal experience that made me feel somewhat of an outsider, although that was true. It mattered to the work, and it mattered to the publication for which I wrote. In that, I saw the gross blind spots that my often well-intended colleagues had in reporting on matters of the world and their local communities. And those blind spots involved, since they're mostly white newsrooms, they no doubt involved race. From my vantage, coming from where I do, what I could pick up on was their blind spots about class and place to some extent. And those two things, of course, intertwine in some complicated but real ways all over this country. And so after some years of, basically finding myself catching the stories that my, again, often well-intentioned colleagues were missing, while also attempting to, just do as objective as possible a report, I found that perhaps I could be of best service to the free press and to the broader media ecosystem, which by the way, I graduated in 2002. So I was the last class that was trained on like a what we now might call an old-fashioned newspaper curriculum. It was shifting at that sort of nascent digital era. To be sure, the curriculum was shifting, but I was the last. My class was the last one to graduate with that what was called news editorial track, and I at that moment then was not just representing a sort of you might argue minority identity within a newsroom in the sense of class. Although we don't often discuss class when we talk about diversity, and I think we should, which is at the heart of my writing. So it was not only that, but also at that precise moment, the digital era was transforming the industry that I had just entered in such a way that a lot of jobs, a lot of smaller media outlets, a lot of even mid-size newspapers with a great legacy of a century of good local coverage were shrinking. And that meant, and that sort of hollowing out of what had been a sort of tried and true business model and structure, which now 20 years on has been dramatically transformed, of course. But at that moment, and this is still true to some extent, it meant that increasingly coastal urban centers, which were always the sort of media power centers, but were now being tasked with explaining the rest of the country to itself in some ways that were really problematic, and put into even greater relief that same awareness that I had of my unusual identity coming from where I did, coming from the class I did. And so around the time that I started writing these essays, I moved back to Kansas, back to the middle of the country, and thought, like, how can I be of best service to this moment in the discourse, in the media? I thought, one, it had a lot to do with place. I need to have my feet on the ground in the place that I believe is being misrepresented in a lot of narratives that were becoming entrenched, often in political frameworks, and also to start, and as this collection attests, over the course of about 10 years of work, to actually enter into the storytelling with the first person, the I, allow my identity to be not just revealed, but intimately drawn out as, I hope, a springboard to discussing class and how it intersects with gender and place and all the rest. So that's how this book came to be. Never, of course, imagined that these essays would be collected in book form, so that's a real treat. There's a range of kind of subgenres within the book. There's a lot of political commentary. I'm often writing against the notion that everybody in a quote unquote red state is, say, wearing a MAGA hat, or that everybody in the working class is, say, a white guy wearing a hard hat. These are things I know firsthand not to be true, not to be accurate, and they're just sort of like easy caricatures at this point. They have become all too familiar to us in the political discourse at a moment when getting it right could not be more important if we are to understand ourselves as a nation, and if we are to write the course as a country and as a democracy. So, so the political commentary is here, but also some much more personal pieces where I'm bearing witness to, in a more memoir fashion, the experiences that I had in my household, on that farm, with my family. And I'll tell you what, when I started writing in this way, while I hold journalists and those who are reporting the news in the highest esteem, and speaking of democracy, think that the Fourth Estate or the government watchdog that civic journalism at its best might be, is there's no more important craft than that. But I will say, when I started moving into these more personal forms of nonfiction, I started hearing from people. I started hearing from thousands and thousands and thousands of people who wanted to say, will you now hear my story about class? Because nobody in our country is talking about that. This is a decade ago. We're talking about it now. We're using that word often in problematic and clunky ways, I think, often in weaponized and inaccurate and misleading ways. But when I started this work, it really, some of the essays in here that ended up, quote unquote, going viral. And so I knew they were worth something because a million people chose to read them, were turned down by editor after editor after editor, who just didn't see, as a sort of gatekeeper within an industry, often sitting in, let's say, somewhere in Manhattan, didn't see the merit in the discussion. And once they broke through and connected with the reader, I heard from those readers in very personal and intimate and often pained ways, just hungry, ravenous to discuss this, again, often overlooked aspect of the American experience. Why is it overlooked? Because we've been telling ourselves for centuries that we're a meritocracy. If we in fact have a class structure, or as my friend Isabel Wilkerson would call it, a caste system even, because by the way, anytime that I'm talking about class, I'm not separating it from race or gender or any of these other aspects of identity that people in power have often, in one of the oldest tricks in the book, pitted as somehow oppositional, when in fact they could not be more related. But if we are to acknowledge that we have a class structure or even a caste system, then we have to really have some hard discussions about what and who we really are as a country, right? And kind of grow up and mature into acknowledging the ways that we have fallen short of that notion of ourselves. And so it hasn't been an easy road always, attempting to insert this notion into the conversation, but such a rewarding one because of the people who then come and tell me their story. When Heartland, my first book, came out in 2018, since we're living in an uber political moment, there's an election on, of course, and I thought that I would highlight a piece in which I'm not actually commenting on the political moment, but rather living a brush with politics myself. When Heartland came out, speaking of those people I started hearing from, it was very well received, and I was fortunate that it got some good attention and had support from a lot of corners and classes and professions. And one of the places that I heard from was Washington, D.C. There were some powerful people who encouraged me to run for office myself. And I will give you a little context. Just after Heartland came out, the longtime United States Senator for Kansas, Pat Roberts, announced that he would not seek re-election. So that meant there was to be an open seat, and conventional political wisdom is that an open seat is easier to, let's say, flip or win in any direction than one where an incumbent is seated. And so I myself didn't have designs on going in such a direction, but so many people kind of gave me a vote of confidence in that way, including readers who were excited at the prospect of someone maybe flipping that seat for the first time since 1932. I thought, well, I owe it to myself and to the honor of that sort of suggestion ever being made to explore it. And explore I did, and in doing so, I found what I think might be a valuable conclusion for you all. What I just got done telling you is how I decided how I could be of best service to journalism, American journalism, the broader media ecosystem, as someone who cares about justice, as someone who cares about truth and nuance and complexity and accuracy. And you might be in some ways asking yourself that same question, not necessarily about your vocation proper, but about your role in this country at this moment that is so incredibly fraught and fractured and divided in ways that I don't have to tell you all. You might also just be super tired of it and checked out, in which case I pass no judgment. But if somewhere around 2016 you started asking yourself, what can I do about this hot mess? I hope that this might offer, some a springboard to your own introspection in that regard. So this is toward the end of that sort of exploration of running for office, which, by the way, I found that, first of all, you already know this, I'm sure, but the United States Senate is like a millionaire's club. And so there would have been a lot of economic hardship for me to take on such an endeavor. Campaigns and campaign finance being what they are, it means that you spend at least a year campaigning during which you have pretty much zero income. There are a lot of ways in which the system is structured so that only quite elite ranks of the broader American population would ever even enter those halls. And while that challenge would not have kept me from pursuing that path if it had been right for me, I'm going to read to you about what did keep me from pursuing that path. While people I knew lost eyeballs and limbs laboring on farms and in factories, I learned to value the work of my body. I was constantly moving, tending, mowing, clearing, hauling, feeding, cleaning, to avoid being chided for the worst offense in my community, sitting on your ass. The chiding was born of necessity. There was much to do and no hired help to do it. It was also the class maintenance, my elders ensuring that I understood the world's plans for me so that I would fall in line, make a paycheck, and survive. I did that labor and will be forever grateful for it, but I knew it wasn't the life I was meant for. The books I cherished and the voice inside me demanded a writerly direction that no one applauded. Why would they? In our society, journalism is so devalued as to be expected free of charge, and creative work is often considered to be worth less than just about any other kind. I long ago climbed over those socioeconomic hurdles and that societal bias to pursue my career. Late in my consideration of the Senate race, though, I realized that my recurring urge to answer the call to run stemmed in part from an unconscious belief that politics is a more effective means for social change than what I already do, and perhaps more worthy of the respect for which a poor farm girl once longed. The pen is not more powerful than the AR-15. Underregulated carbon emissions, unsustainable consumption, xenophobia, unlivable wages, nationalism, the prison industrial complex, the military industrial complex, the medical industrial complex, or dark money's political influence. It is, however, antecedent to some future world that will not abide these things. Of all the reasons that I have dedicated my life to witnessing intergenerational poverty and trauma, a process that has enriched me professionally, but that requires an incessant, unpleasant reconnection with the painful past I overcame. The most fundamental is that I dream of a world in which no child suffers for our country's greed. In this era of political minority rule, the American left has wisely acknowledged the limitations of simply telling people to vote. This is something for us all to keep in mind about November 5th? November 5th? On November 6th, we're all still going to be here, and there's going to be a bunch of problems still to handle. And so in this sort of like crescendo toward the election, I hope this might be some reminder. Some elected bodies are so intractable that even holding office may be ineffective. Chloe Maxman, an environmental activist who in 2018 became the first Democrat to represent her rural district in the Maine state legislature, was a rising political star who wrote with her campaign manager, Kenyon Woodward, a well-received book on renewing rural politics. Yet Maxman herself, now the youngest female state senator in Maine's history, announced earlier this year that she would not seek re-election. For now, she told me, she sees more potential impact in movement building. She and Woodward have founded a nonprofit, Dirt Road Organizing, to empower rural people and combat polarization. In June 2019, Senator Elizabeth Warren emailed me after receiving my thank you card, which had expressed with some sadness that running for Senate wasn't right for me, at least not for now. Sarah, I got your very generous note, she wrote, from the presidential campaign trail while her candidacy was soaring in the polls. She wrote, there are many ways to serve. I never officially announced that I wasn't running, and my spirits sometimes lingered along the road not taken. Several declared Democratic candidates withdrew from the race, making way for former Republican and pro-choice State Senator Barbara Boyer to win the primary. Despite her impressive fundraising, Representative Roger Marshall defeated her in the general election by 11 points. In one of his first acts as senator, Marshall would join a small handful of colleagues who voted to overturn the presidential election results just hours after the deadly siege on the Capitol by Trump supporters. Alongside my fellow Kansans, I mourned this development in a unique way, and I winced at the many instances to come in which one Senate vote could have changed the world. I took heart, though, noticing in videos that New York Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez had my book Heartland on her bookshelf. More recently, I cheered when, in the country's first vote on reproductive rights following the overturning of Roe v. Wade, Kansans across party and urban-rural lines roundly defeated a proposed amendment to the state constitution to eliminate the right to an abortion, life-saving confirmation of the nuance that my writing had insisted was true. Throughout my professional explorations of government and politics, a knowing abided. As society tears, some Americans will emerge dramatically altered from a stars and stripes cocoon. Some of us, though, will find that the next right thing to be is the thing we have been all along. Thanks so much. I would love to talk with you all now. It's my favorite part of these book tours is hearing from you, whether it's a question or a comment on any of these matters. And I'm good at sitting through an awkward silence. I'm professional at it now, professional. Or a comment. Class, is anybody here? Who here's from a rural area by chance? 1, 2, 3, ish. Fair enough. Cool. Yeah, it's I was in Kansas City last night, and I would say, I don't know, maybe half the crowd, their hands went up. I always find that in this part of the country, wherever I ask that question, hands go up, which is one of the many reasons that it's so silly that we talk about, this binary of the divide, because most people are carrying simultaneous narratives, whether that's in class terms or in place terms, and when you get down on the ground and talk to people about their experiences, it's just very rarely captured by the phrase urban-rural divide. But anyway, in this part of the country, I find that more hands go up. So it is something about probably the agricultural legacy of this area means that even folks who, by way of industrialization and urbanization, ended up in places like St. Louis or Kansas City or Chicago, oftentimes they're not more than a couple generations off the farm. So, yeah.
How do you not take offense to fly over country? Like whenever someone tells me that, I get angry and I have to just throw it aside. Because I think it's maybe well-intentioned, like you mentioned, but...
Well, I don't think that's well-intentioned.
Well, I have colleagues in Chicago who talk about fly over country. Like, you live in Illinois.
Right.
You know?
Yeah.
And I don't... Maybe it isn't well-intentioned, but how do you not become so defensive to where it could harm your professional credentials or something like that? Because it all exists.
Can I add one other one to that? The one I hate even more is the great wasteland between the two coasts.
Yeah. Or often, I'm working on a book right now about the tallgrass prairie ecosystem, most of the remaining stand of which is in the Flint Hills of Kansas. It's the most endangered ecosystem on the continent, by the way, and probably one least discussed. And the reason that relates to what you just said is often people will refer to driving through that area as it's so boring because it's nothing. Because actually grasslands are some of the most important and biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. But that nothing, wasteland, flyover country. That's deep in the collective of our country for sure. And it results in not just some of the stereotypes I was talking about, but some casually unchecked insulting language like flyover country. So how to navigate that one. I do take issue with it, to be sure. And as I said, I've spent some years now writing about how I take issue with it. That's just a sort of microcosm of this broader kind of placism that sometimes involves classism. But even apart from class, it's a reality that power with a capital P in this country, yeah, there are nooks and crannies in the middle of the country, but for the most part, that's a coastal enterprise, and flyover, of course, refers to literally flying from coast to coast. And so how to, I attempt to address that and sort of not only validate the offense that someone like yourself might feel, but also to wake up the person who is using that term, maybe without, conscious derision. I do think, though, that when language like that is completely unchecked and unconscious, it does suggest or reveal something under the surface in terms of a deep belief or position or default assumption about our place. And so if I'm in like a professional setting and someone says, and it happens all the time, and even when people know what I write about for a living, even people who have been my professional allies, happens all the time in myriad ways. And not just that term, but just it's like a default assumption that I'm on in the Eastern time zone, or just like things that are, again, they're not like pointed insults, but they indicate a cultural marginalization of sorts of this place. And so I usually offer the benefit of the doubt that someone just needs a little bit of a wake up call, and I'll maybe like gently push back on or call out with a laugh. Now, if something is just intentionally mean or insulting, and that happens less often, but it happens, then I've definitely like taken issue with and taken people to task at moments such as that. But I do find that how like your dad or your grandpa perhaps maybe used a turn of phrase that is clearly racist to those of us who have examined that the conundrum of white supremacy in this country, and yet maybe isn't actually consciously realizing that it's a slur. Some words are very clearly slurs. I think it's it's operating in a similar way, where it's like it's so deep in the language. So it tells us, so when those terms I was just referencing are so deep in the language, that tells you we are swimming in white supremacy. And there are parallels in other marginalized identities, I think, where it's just common parlance. And sometimes if in good faith you point it out to someone, then they do better. Yeah.
Well, as a journalist, I don't know whether this is true, but I have the sense, I've only been in St. Louis for 2 years, and I really love this place.
Cool.
And, but I am aware of the very bad press that we get, just constantly, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, stories about how bad it is here. And that if you hung out in New York in the wrong neighborhood, that it would be the same thing. I just feel so frustrated and helpless about not being able to turn that around, not being able to get the kind of press that we need in order to be, able to survive as a city with the infrastructure that we have. you know.
Yeah. You rightly, thank you for your work in journalism. You rightly point out that, or are pointing at in your comment that these are not just matters of, like personal comfort in a given conversation. They lead to resource investment or lack thereof. They lead to, who can access a particular kind of opportunity and who can't. They have real economic and structural repercussions in our country. One such repercussion, I'll tell you, is the freaking red and blue map that I hate. Put that up, and there's this monochrome assigned to each state, which tells you something about the Electoral College, but it doesn't tell you much at all about those places. Any given one of which has about a 60-40 split, where the majority takes all and 2 in 5 people, even in a place like the Dakotas where it's 70-30, is 1 in 3 people are erased by that political framework. And so the example I'm giving then is because of that framework and its entrenchment in even like our toxic 2-party system. Let's say the Democratic Party has for decades just chosen not to invest resources in places that were deemed a lost cause because of there's some realities there in the red blue map, just like there are some seeds of truth in the bad story about St. Louis or anywhere else, but it's more complicated. The truth is more nuanced, and when we brush that aside to these easy simplifications, we harm ourselves as a country, not just in our understanding of ourselves, but to your point in just the in rural America, I would say the most pressing concern would be economic development. So how are you going to get people? Now we're living in the era of, if you're so fortunate to have a job where you might be a quote unquote digital nomad, and meanwhile cities are pricing people out because they're so dang expensive. And so there are a million reasons why we might see like a rural revitalization, and there are definitely places where that's happening, and I've reported on it. But by and large, the good and decent people that are trying to tell the very true and real story of their place, which is more diverse than it's portrayed, more decent and complicated than it's portrayed, have a hell of a time getting somebody to move there, even for all of the beautiful things it has to offer, because of these attitudes that are captured by often these really lazy headlines. Yeah.
A question from an online watcher that you kind of touched on a little bit, but if you had anything else to say. The Electoral College has been described both as anti-democratic, but also a protector of rural democratic power. What are your thoughts about this part of our political process?
Well, if you study, thank you to those joining via live stream. The history of the Electoral College, there are some critiques, to be sure, that involve, speaking of white supremacy, and that sort of framework or that lens through which you can discern how the Electoral College came to be. But if we are just talking about the usual defense in modern times, that it protects less populous regions from a sort of like, dense population center rule, let's say. I don't think that actually holds up, in that everywhere I go in quote unquote red states, I hate even using the term, and talk to people about their reality, not always members of the political minority, by the way. They don't feel seen and represented. Somehow we're claiming that that's what the Electoral College is all about. But I referenced in that reading that first ballot measure on reproductive rights post-Roe going down in Kansas, ruby red, right? And of course, a coalition across party lines, including a lot of rural counties that had gone for Trump in the recent presidential, voted down that ballot measure to preserve reproductive rights. So like when you poll people, when you sort of like pry the reality of people and their beliefs and their views away from, this, like, there are these 2 parties to vote for at the top of the ticket, to send somebody to the White House, you find that often even a quote unquote Republican identity does not actually play out in places like Oklahoma have expanded Medicaid when it's a ballot measure, or have voted for to legalize medicinal marijuana when it's a ballot measure. So I think that there are so many places, and again, places considered red or ruby red, where I talk to people of all political stripes who feel like government is not working for them. That, of course, the Electoral College is only one piece of that puzzle. There are a zillion other rungs and corners and puzzle pieces of the broader political framework. But I actually very rarely talk to somebody who's a fan. And so I think that the defense of the Electoral College maybe is one more of those just entrenched narratives, is like, actually, when you get down and ask people what they think, I haven't seen polls about it recently, and so feel free to take me to task on that if I'm getting it wrong. But I think we're sort of its expiration date is nigh in terms of where the culture is, and I find that to be true in a lot of different kinds of places. Yeah. Hi.
So first of all, the foothills in Kansas are amazing. Missouri is another state that expanded Medicaid, the ballot initiative. I wanted to ask you what you think about the loss of local journalism and how it contributes to some of the things you write about.
Yeah, I was getting at that a bit in, a very both personal and professional decision I made that was highly consequential in my life, maybe the most consequential decision I ever made. Capitalist country that we are, where we generally, jobs and economic opportunity are what drive our place and our choices. That's why most Kansas counties peaked in population not in 1980, but in 1905. And a lot of those people who left, it wasn't because they hated where they were from or wanted to quote unquote get out. Policy was intentionally structured to force them out and end up in industrial centers and become kind of cogs in that particular wheel. I think the loss of local journalism is just of a piece with that broader kind of shift where, again, to my mind, federal policy specifically has pulled a lot of levers that require people to quote unquote get out of places that they are from. I was encouraged to do just that. And so my choosing to return to Kansas was probably the most consequential decision that I ever made in terms of my life outcomes, my professional trajectory. I turned down some opportunities to do so, but I also have fed my soul and felt at home, and I think in some important ways been of service to a region or a state or an environment or a rural experience that doesn't have a lot of voices, speaking with some kind of national platform that I'm fortunate to have. So that's kind of why I feel it so keenly, but of course the way that it's affecting every one of you and every one of us is completely part and parcel with what I've been talking about tonight, which is how, like, who gets to tell the story about a place? Who gets to tell the story about a people? Now, we could argue, and rightly so, that social media, the digital era, in a sense, democratizes opportunity to tell a story about a place. And that is not to be discounted, and those exact tools and a sort of what we might call citizen journalism of sorts has been not only crucial to documenting in accurate terms what's happening in a place, but also has been, at the root of some important grassroots social justice movements in recent times to, outside of journalism in terms of that same sort of mechanism is shaking us up in a lot of ways. Some are good, some are bad. But in terms of like who has the organizational structure behind them to make it their livelihood, who's getting like benefits and a salary to be a storyteller. Increasingly over the course of my 20 plus year career, that has meant leaving not just rural America, but leaving perhaps the middle of the country. There are very few, in fact, I'm not aware of anyone else in my graduating class from that J School and KU I've referenced, who's still making a living as a journalist. Now, I'm not saying like that I could swear up and down that I am the only one, but I've stayed in touch with the better part of that, relatively small and tight-knit class, and most of them are working in like public relations, or they're working at a desk in a museum, or nothing wrong with those jobs, but journalism, it ain't. Hi, speaking of journalism.
Hi, Sarah. It's good to see you again.
You too.
I've got a combo question for you. One is, did you hear from Tim Walz after your opinion piece in the New York Times? And second, when you look at Tim Walz and then Vance, are you seeing like the two versions of rural America in their personages and what they publicly seem to represent?
Oh, I think you could make that argument for sure. So he's referencing an op-ed that I wrote for the New York Times a few weeks ago when Walz was tapped as the vice presidential pick on the Democratic ticket. And in that piece, I'm basically arguing that he represents a voice or an identity that I, in my lifetime, have never seen on the presidential ticket. And by that, I mean being of a particular place. He's from, of course, small town Nebraska. They keep referencing, both parties love to talk about the middle class. I've said middle class. But I hear about his background, and it sounds, I think he got a college degree at a state university, small state college by way of the GI Bill. And so if we're just using a 4-year degree as a clunky parameter for working versus middle class, which is often the case in polls and all kinds of discussions that completely fail the topic, then okay, I guess he's middle class. And I think his dad was like a school administrator. So I suppose that he, as a Korean War vet who was like a son of a, corn farmer or something, that middle class is very different than the middle class that like my friends who live in Brooklyn, say, are talking about. And so to me, he sounds and feels and looks like a particular kind of guy that I was raised by and around. Decent, straightforward, a particular, there's like for all our being a sort of like fancying ourselves kind of like a post-place society by way of all those digital tools, there's still something very specific to a literal place and a region that involves just the character and the cadence and the culture of a place. And I see from, Kansas, and he was up there in rural Nebraska, I see my place. And so that I made that argument. No, I didn't hear from him. And I do once in a while get asked to do some kind of campaign. I can't tell you how many times I have said, while I wear my opinion on my sleeve as a commentator, I do not and will not, as long as I am, like fancying myself a journalist as I have all these years, participate in any direct overt political. In fact, that's one of the reasons that it felt so wrong for me to enter into that fray, because even though people do make that shift across that line back and forth, I personally am very uneasy with it. I felt like if I run for office, I'm turning in my credentials, and I'm not sure that I'll ever deserve to have them back. That's just my personal ethics. So I do often say, no, I won't do the first gens for Harris Zoom call or whatever. So no, I didn't hear from him. I did though hear from a lot of people who kind of validated the idea that I was suggesting. They made a good move. If that party wants to make some inroads in places they've previously sort of left on the table for the other guys, the other side to get at by way of messaging and appropriation of cultural symbols, and that's a whole nother talk. But I think they made a smart move if they want to really start showing up and feeling like and having people feel seen and looked at in all those quote unquote red places. So, and I think that even beyond that, there have been some moves made that suggest that, they went to Atlanta and then I think they did like a bus tour through rural Georgia. They know that they're probably not going to win those counties, but so much of, and you were talking about, God, you're so fed up with this moment of just beating your head again, and you were saying like, how do you, and they're still using these words. Here's the thing, like these things may not, it took generations to get here. It took decades to get here. And we in this room may well not see a moment where, class is not a problem in this country, and the two-party system is not a broken affair, and with a rural-urban divide on red and blue maps, and where narratives are, spoken from and led by people who own them outright. We might not see it, but I think that they earn some of my respect when they put some effort into going into a place where they might not see it, but there's a future generation that will. And then in the back, yeah.
Hey, just moved here from Baltimore and am pretty online, so coastal and digital. One of the things you're talking about a lot is place.
Yeah.
What are your sort of thoughts about being embedded in a place where you didn't grow up, not coming home to?
Yeah. So, and you grew up in Baltimore,
Yeah.
and that's what, okay, cool. So thoughts on basically like a shift of place and a relocation. So, and I've done that too. I don't know how long you'll be around in this lovely city, but it might be for a lifetime. And if that's the case, I know that I mentioned that I'm, a big fan of the Tallgrass Prairie and writing a book about it. It might sound like kind of left field, but it actually is of a piece with the rest of my work in ways that book will reveal. But some of the most just like rabid defenders of that ecosystem and people who are just find it to be like their Zen space are actually, I have found in my reporting, people who are not even from the region. They came to it and they found that, I do think, as somebody who thinks a lot about place, one, it doesn't have to be an either or. We can carry our home with us, and then also, like when I lived in New York, there are good people everywhere. There are wonders everywhere. There are pros and cons everywhere, and some of my dearest friends live there, and I sometimes miss it. I was there for the book tour last week. I was like, oh, the Strand, and maybe I'll move back, but I know I won't. So we don't have to draw a line and say I'm here and so therefore they're bad, of course. And I know that's not your question, but that sort of recalibrating of identity around where you are choosing to hang your hat is a very important and consequential thing in your life outcomes. Who you meet, who you marry, what you eat, how much money you make, what's the weather, how's climate change going to treat you. I think, by the way, this area is going to get a lot sexier to people on the coast in a few decades. So I think I always think that like I had in my trajectory, in my experience, the place that I'm from happens to be my home. That's not true for everyone. And there are a lot of reasons why a person might not even feel safe in the place that they're from. I didn't have that experience personally. So where you're from and home, I don't necessarily think are the same thing. For me, they are the same, but what I think is beautiful and we don't give enough appreciation to in our sort of like, and again, I think this is a product of capitalism and industrialization and urbanization, is like it's like you go for the job or for very rarely, is anybody in here a reader of Wendell Berry by any chance? So he writes about place. He's from he's a Kentucky farmer. I would say is sort of like a middle class or economically very comfortable sort of agrarian experience. But I love that he talks about fidelity to place, and he, like me, is from the place that feels like home. But whether that's true or not, wherever is home, that's a concept that in and of itself potentially challenges the machinery of capitalism, because it wants to dislocate us. It wants us to go where there's more money, where there's where you make it, where hustle culture leads you, where industry wants your labor, and so on. And there are, I used to tell my friends in New York, here's another sort of a turn of phrase that sort of like casually suggests that one place is superior to another. If you can make it there, you can make it anywhere. Well, I would say to my friends, some people aren't here because they don't want to make it here. They damn well could if they wanted to, but they've used a different value set to decide where they're going to plant themselves. So welcome to the middle of the country. I hope it's treating you well so far. We like to recruit good ones. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I have a question. I'm a fellow KU grad,
Rock chalk.
something like that. But it came from a very different direction and it impacted me in different ways. And the end of the question is going to be how it impacted you. But so I'm the son of a New Yorker who went to an Ivy League college and moved here to escape the East Coast and grew up, middle class, upper middle class, but in an area that was very well-to-do surrounding me. Went to KU, and I'm Jewish. Went to KU, lived in a mainstream dorm, not a private dorm or anything, and found to be an oddity being Jewish and urban. And then my roommate was from Russell. So I went to Russell for a weekend with him and hung out, and it was a very different experience for me. And that impacted me in what turns out to be interesting ways to me anyway. And I just wonder if sort of the reverse of that happened to you, both when you came to KU, because there certainly is a upper middle class and beyond group at KU, and then Columbia is like a whole different world.
Yeah.
So, I'm just wondering, how that impacted you, perhaps in an opposite way that it impacted me.
Yeah. And you live here in St. Louis now.
I do.
Okay.
I do.
Well, what a lovely question. How, Russell, home to, I believe, Bob Dole,
That's right.
speaking of the United States Senate, how was your experience there? Was it, did they treat you well, or did you feel othered for your culture and religion?
Both. But I did learn how to tip a cow.
Hey,
So that was, it was cultural.
Yeah.
No, very nice roommate, nice fellow, good family.
Good.
Treated fine, but a very different experience.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I do think that it goes both ways. It goes in every direction. Now, I will say, this wasn't your question, and but I want to make this.
I'm not sure there
quickly.
was one.
Well, I know, I think it's an interesting and an important in a way I'll get to in just a second, but I want to say first that sometimes people say to me, well, you talk about, places I'm about in the middle of the country or whatever, or somebody in a city looking down their nose at people who live in the country as though they're bumpkins and backwards and so on. It goes in the opposite direction. People in the country are fearful of cities and so on. I know there's a grain of truth to that, but here's why that it's not, to me, it's like saying that, it's like asserting that there's such a thing as reverse racism. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Or asserting, or say like that we need like a men's rights movement because women coming up in terms of their rights and opportunities is somehow like threatening to. If there is a power structure about place, and I certainly would argue that there is, and I think that most sociologists would also argue that there is, and historians. It's not black or white, of course. It's complicated, and there's rich people in the country, and there's a whole bunch of poor people in cities, and there's power everywhere and lack of it everywhere. But roughly speaking, just geographic proximity to certain opportunities is I wouldn't go as far as to say a privilege, but it's an advantage over geographic isolation. And so that being said, the reason that I don't think saying it goes both ways quite works, one, I actually don't know anybody in a rural area, I know a lot of them who I've never heard someone say, oh, those terrible people in the cities. That's definitely a Fox News narrative. But I have never, when I moved to New York, for example, nobody said, oh my God, clutch your purse or what. And here's why I think most people who live in rural places, and this is probably more true now than ever, have been to cities many times. They've had to go to a city for some reason, whether it's a friggin' hospital because the one in their area closed down, or if it was because their kid left the farm and moved to one, or whether it's because they went on a vacation and you go to see the Statue of Liberty or wherever. That doesn't mean you come to truly understand a place, but you've set foot there, you've interacted with people, you've smiled and shaken hands and seen that there's all kinds of people everywhere. There are a lot of people I know personally who live in urban environments who have never been to a place like the one that I come from and the one that I write about. And so I don't think it's quite, goes both ways in that way. Now, your point about how does something shape you when you go into that very different space, I think that more often than not, it's in beautiful ways. It's in expansive ways. So like when I went to my first time living in New York, actually was still an undergrad, and I got an internship at the time I was kind of considering going into broadcasting. It was at 30 Rock, 2 years off the farm. I encountered a whole bunch of classism and nasty comments about where I come from and how I talk, but I also met some really lovely people and had great adventures and felt, expanded and like my worldview had shifted in ways that are still with me. And I think that has to be true for anyone, regardless of the direction they're moving in, to more rural or more urban or up and down, sideways, into. I think that it behooves all of us when we get out from behind screens to understand a place or people, and we go there, whether it's on a trip or for what reason. I was a fellow at the University of Chicago Institute of Politics a few years ago, and they have a really cool program where they take the kids from Chicago who are overwhelmingly from more economically privileged backgrounds, and they do like a swap with, in Chicago they refer to the rural areas to the south as downstate, and so they'll do like a swap with the kids at like a small state college, or maybe even like a VOTEC or a 2-year kind of degree program, and they kind of switch places for a week, and I got to talk to some of those students, and they all, whether they had grown up in New York and came to UChicago, or they grew up in a small town somewhere in the Midwest, and they're going to this more kind of working class college downstate, they all loved it. And I think that when you go to a place suddenly, well, I don't know what her actual field is, sociology. Some of you might know Brene Brown. She's kind of like in the culture. I don't know if she coined this, but she says it and it sounds right. It's hard to hate up close. Get close, go in. And so that's a little bit tangential or to the side of the point that you were making. But I think that the real universal truth in that statement is whatever your assumptions are about a place. They might not even be hateful, but if it's an assumption, often getting out from behind a screen and going into that space will disrupt it with the complicated truth on the ground. Yeah.
We've got time for maybe one more question
Yes,
before we move to
one
signs.
more.
So.
Go ahead.
Sure.
Pat is hand up.
So, turns out our backgrounds are not that different. Why not high school? I suspect you know the place.
Yeah, of
Yes.
course.
Then Harvard, degree in English, then University of Kansas for medical school. I had to get the wrong job.
Yeah, thank you.
But the real question is this, given your new book, is Cottonwood Falls the prettiest town in the whole state of Kansas?
I think it might be. It sounds like you've driven through the prairie before. Yeah. Yeah. So Cottonwood Falls is if any of you have ever read kind of like the last and sort of like seminal book about that area, was Prairie Earth by, I believe, Columbia, Missouri's own William Least Moon. Thank you. And that's a beautiful hybrid nonfiction form about that spot in Cottonwood Falls. Turns out Chase County is now like a ranching culture. The reason that the prairie still exists there and only 4% of it is left, used to cover a third of the landmass of the contiguous 48. The reason that the last stand is there in those flint hills is because the flint in those hills kept the plow from busting the sod, and otherwise they damn well would have planted row crops there like they did everywhere else. My poor European ancestors included, complicit in that transforming of a region and an ecosystem into quote unquote the breadbasket of the world, or a bunch of annual monoculture crops. So I highly recommend, I'll leave that note as a sort of like, maybe you'll remember when my next book comes out in a couple of years. And I do think that the beauty of that place and it having been overlooked, and you were speaking to that at the beginning of our conversation, is just one of the many ways that we miss out on the truth about ourselves as a country, by way of often political frameworks that reduce really beautiful and interesting and complicated places into stereotypes. So thanks so much for having me.
K-177, start in Manhattan, go south to I-35.
Thank you. It's all true.
Thank you all so much for joining us tonight. If you haven't gotten your book yet, we've got Bone to Bone as well as Heartland for sale at the front desk. Books that were bought tonight have already been signed. If you'd like Sarah to add a personalization, or if you're bringing a book that you got prior to tonight, we can do that right at the front here. Thank you all.
Did you say that